All right, welcome again. This is Pastor Brendan Johnston. What I'm going to do right now is I'm going to fly through 4 of these letters in the New Testament. Actually 5. 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Philippians, Galatians, and 1st Thessalonians. Unlike Romans, these letters are all written to deal with specific situations. Here's the big question I want you to be thinking about so that way we can touch on it when we meet again on Wednesday. Which church is dealing with issues that most remind you of what we are going through right now? The Corinthians, Philippians, Galatians, or Thessalonians? All right, as we get started, I want you to think. Tell me about all of the churches that you know about here in town. Of course, you know about Bethlehem. Then there's Emmanuel Lutheran. Actually, for most of our history, we were part of different Lutheran groups, but in the 1980s, we became part of the same Lutheran denomination. We've been good partners and good neighbors for most of our history. Maybe you will also be thinking about the United Church just down the street. The United Church is actually part of a joining between 2 different kinds of Christian groups. So you've got Presbyterians and Methodists. There's the Catholic Church. There's the Baptist Church. There's the Assemblies of God Church, Living Waters Fellowship, right on the main road through town. There's the Evangelical Free Church just off of the Scenic Highway. And those are just the churches here in town. I guess there's also the Missouri Synod Lutheran Church. I shouldn't have forgotten them, but I did. Sorry. And most of the time, we as churches get along really well. The pastors and I, we are able to work together on projects. We focus on the fact that Jesus unites us. Our faith in Jesus unites us, even though we have some difference. But sometimes you're going to notice churches not getting along well at all. You're going to notice churches that either have fights within them or churches that have fights between one another. That happens when churches lose their focus on Jesus as our unity. And when churches start fighting with one another about pointless things, then again, there are some important things that need to be fought for. But when churches fight about pointless, needless things, frequently those who are not in the church look at that and say, I don't need that in my life. These churches do not seem like Jesus. I don't want to be part of this. That problem of churches fighting needlessly and that challenge to stay focused on Jesus who unites us, that's the very beginning of Paul's letter to the Corinthians. Paul wrote 3 letters to the Corinthian church. We don't have the 3rd one. We just have the 1st and 2nd one. Long story. And both of these letters, 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians, they're pretty long letters. And the reason why they're pretty long letters is that the Corinthian church didn't just have a problem with fighting with one another. They had lots of problems within themselves. You had a lot of people within the church saying that if we are forgiven, then we get to go do whatever the heck we want, and it doesn't matter. By the way, one thing about Corinth that Paul had to deal with, that was a town that was absolutely full of brothels and prostitution, and Paul needed to deal with the fact that members of the church tried to justify frequenting some of those brothels because Jesus meant that they were forgiven, and Paul had to say very clearly, no, Jesus means that we need to live differently, that Jesus means we need to live lives that honor God with all parts of our life. Now, there is so much we could get into about all of the problems that the Corinthian churches faced. Like when some members of the church would sneak in and consume all of the communion before everyone else because they thought they needed Jesus more than others. Or doing worship services that seemed wild and out of control and a turnoff to people who tried to learn more about what Christianity was about. But what Paul wanted to really make clear to them is that at the end of the day, what matters the most is living in love. In 1 Corinthians chapter 13, we find Paul's great chapter on love, where he says, look, you could be as smart as anyone, but if you don't have love, that doesn't count for anything. You could do incredible works of service, but if you are doing that without love, that's really not connecting you to God. He reminded them that love is patient, love is kind, love is not easily angered, love is not arrogant, love is not boastful, love is not rude. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, love endures all things, and in fact, love will outlast this world. That in the end, love will endure beyond anything else that you and I know, that the greatest things in life are faith and hope and love, and the greatest of these is love. The Corinthian church needed to live in love, to reject self-gratification and indulgence, and living sinfully and justifying it. And they also needed to reject the needless fights that they had been getting into as a congregation, and instead focus on living out love. And now here's one question that I want you guys to hang on to with all of this from Corinthians. Who are the people that you struggle to love? Who are the people that you have a difficult time getting along with? Pray, Jesus, help me love my enemies. Help me love them completely. Help me love them completely. All right, so now to talk about the book of 1 Thessalonians very quickly. The letter to the Thessalonian church was focused on two sides of one coin. On the one hand, Paul was asking them to focus on living lives full of hard work as a way of modeling the transforming power of Jesus. But he was also at the same time dealing with the fact that some people were so convinced that Jesus was going to be returning immediately that they weren't worrying about daily life because they thought that prayer and worship were more important than anything else and that focusing on this life didn't matter. There's an American author named Mark Twain who liked to say that there are some people who are so heavenly minded that they're no earthly good. That's some of the people in the Thessalonian church that Paul was dealing with. And yet mixed into that preoccupation with God and Jesus' return, he was also dealing with something else. The people in the church had been so convinced that Jesus would return soon that the fact that it had taken so long was shaking their trust in God. These days, you're going to find sooner or later that there are parts of the Christian church that continue to be so focused on predicting the date when the world will end. And these folks always get a lot of attention. The last time that this happened, in 2011, a preacher named Harold Camping was predicting that the world would end, and there were people who ended up selling everything they had and giving their money to this preacher. When the world did not, in fact, end, they had to pick up the pieces of their lives, having lost everything, believing a preacher who had lied to them. Paul is reminding us in 1 Thessalonians that there is a need to balance our hope in what God has in store for us in the future, our hope that one day Jesus will return and all things will be set to right, with the fact that we also need to go through life planning for the future and prepared for the future. Sometimes people say that you hope for the best and plan for the worst. In Christian terms, we look to the future with hope, knowing that because Jesus is alive, God wins, and yet at the same time, we save for retirement. We buy insurance. We work hard so that way we can take care of and support those who need the help. And frankly, that connects us to Jesus because Jesus lived his life caring for those who needed help. So 2 more churches that I wanted to talk about really quickly. Paul's earliest letter of all of the ones that he wrote, at least the ones we have, is this one to the Galatians, a city in Galatia. The Galatians were struggling with questions that seem very strange to us. They were struggling with the big question of if Jesus was a Jewish person, if Jesus was raised within a Jewish society, if Jesus celebrated the Sabbath, and if Jesus worshipped in the temple and made sacrifices like everyone else, if Jesus did all of these things, then should we be expecting new followers of Jesus to take on Jewish customs? Should we be expecting them to observe Jewish holidays? As a church, we settled this a really long time ago. God loves you just the way you are, and God doesn't need you to become someone else. God doesn't need you to become a different kind of person. God needs you to become fully human. God needs you to embrace the way of Jesus completely, but that doesn't mean that you give up being American or Canadian or Brazilian or Ethiopian or from China or Russia. You don't need to give up who you are or your heritage or your ethnicity. But that was difficult because the earliest followers of Jesus were all Jewish. But Jesus was good news for the whole world. But there was this tension because the whole Jewish way of life was so important to the earliest disciples that they did get into some fights about whether or not new people who were not themselves Jewish needed to become fully Jewish. In Paul's letter to the Galatians, Paul is saying, no, you don't need to worry about that. Where this comes in for us, though, is this. We can assume that to be Christian is to become like us, or to become like the people that we know. I challenge you in your life, go to churches that are different from you. I want you to go to a Russian Orthodox church where they worship God almost entirely in Russian, or a Greek Orthodox church. I want you sometime in your life to try to go to a church that has been historically a black congregation. The point is this: we are part of a worldwide community of faith. People from around the world follow Jesus, and we all do it differently. And when we learn from one another, our faith is blessed by them, and their faith is blessed by ours. We all have blessings to give, and we all have blessings that we need. Soon, at the end of the month, will be Pentecost on May 31st, when we celebrate how people from every place around the world, speaking endless languages, were all accepted by God in God's church. We need to live our lives and live our faith as though God is not just for people like me, but for all people. The last letter that I want to look at today is Philippians. Philippi is another one of these Greek cities, and actually Philippi was a place where Roman soldiers liked to retire to. Roman soldiers tended to make Philippi their home. And here's the thing about Roman soldiers. Of course, they're going to be more than a little patriotic, more than a little enthusiastic about Roman traditions, Roman culture, Roman gods. So the Christian community in Philippi ended up getting roughed up a lot by some of the people who lived in that town. They had a very tough time. And actually, the letter to the Philippians by Paul was written at a time when Paul himself was off at another place, locked up in prison. Possibly he was in prison in Rome waiting to be executed. But what Paul said again and again throughout his letter to the Philippians is that, you know what? We can rejoice in all circumstances. Rejoice. Again, I say rejoice. Paul wrote that in chains in prison. Paul reminded them that just like they were both going through difficult times, Jesus himself suffered. And the difficult times they were all going through connected them to Jesus, and that by being connected to Jesus, they could rejoice in all circumstances. So just to recap, the Corinthians, as a church, they had so many issues. And Paul was helping to get them refocused on God, refocused on love, and less focused on living out of an indulgence in themselves. Paul wrote to the Thessalonians to get them a little bit more grounded in day-to-day life rather than being so focused on God's future that they were forgetting to be living out their faith in the present. Paul wrote to the Galatians to remind them that yes, in fact, God meant that they didn't all need to live one way, to live as Jewish people in order to follow Jesus. God accepted them as they were. And then in Paul's letter to the Philippians, Paul was saying to them, in all circumstances, we can rejoice even in these difficult times because we are connected to Jesus no matter what. See you guys on Wednesday. God bless you.